I still remember the exact moment my daughter-in-law called me homeless, and strangely enough, that wasn't even the worst thing that happened to me that week. My name is Margaret Whitmore, I'm 68 years old, and for more than 4 decades I woke up before sunrise every morning on the same piece of land just outside Cedar Ridge, Iowa. That farm wasn't just property on a map. It was the place where my husband and I built our life together, where my son Daniel took his first steps in the kitchen with muddy boots, where every fence post and every apple tree carried a memory. I knew every acre the way some people know their favorite hymn. The gravel road that led to the red barn stretched nearly half a mile from the highway, and on quiet mornings the only sounds were wind across the fields and the soft creak of the porch swing my husband installed 30 years ago. But 2 nights ago everything changed. When I say everything, I truly mean everything. I woke up just after midnight to a strange glow through my bedroom window, the kind of orange light that doesn't belong in the countryside at that hour. By the time I stepped outside, the sky above the barn looked like a sunset that had come at the wrong time of day. Neighbors called the fire department and they came as quickly as they could from town, but farms sit far apart out here and water takes time to travel down long rural roads. I stood at the edge of the yard wrapped in my old wool coat, watching the place I'd spent 40 years caring for disappear into smoke and sparks drifting up into the night sky. By sunrise, the barn was gone, the equipment shed was gone, and most of the storage buildings were nothing but dark outlines against the ground. The house itself was still standing, but the damage meant I couldn't stay there safely for a while. The insurance company promised someone would come look in a few days, but anyone who has lived in the country long enough knows that days can stretch into weeks when paperwork gets involved. So that morning I did the one thing I believed any mother should be able to do. I drove 20 miles into town to see my son Daniel. I didn't bring much with me, just a small suitcase and the photo of my husband that usually sits beside my bed. I wasn't asking for anything permanent. I only needed a place to stay for a short while until the situation on the farm was sorted out. Daniel opened the door looking surprised, but before he could say much, my daughter-in-law Ashley stepped into the hallway behind him, crossed her arms and looked me up and down like I was someone knocking to sell magazines. Then she said the words that still echo in my ears even now. "Well," she said with a small shrug, "I guess you're basically homeless now." I stood there in the doorway for a moment after Ashley said it, holding the handle of my old brown suitcase like it suddenly weighed 50 pounds instead of 10. The hallway behind Daniel smelled faintly like the lemon cleaner Ashley always used on the kitchen counters, and for a strange second it reminded me of all the Sundays I used to spend in this same house when Daniel first bought it, helping him paint the living room and bringing casseroles over while he and Ashley unpacked boxes. Back then Ashley used to call me Mom with a bright smile, the kind that made me believe we would be one of those families who stayed close no matter what happened. But that morning the word homeless hung in the air like something heavy that nobody wanted to move. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck the way he always did when he felt uncomfortable. Then he glanced at Ashley before looking back at me. I kept waiting for him to laugh and say something like, "Mom, you know you can stay here as long as you need," but the words never came. Instead he shifted his weight and said quietly that the house was already crowded, and that things were complicated right now. Complicated was an interesting way to describe a house with 3 bedrooms, a finished basement, and a backyard big enough to park 3 trucks. I looked past him into the living room where the same brown couch I helped pick out 5 years earlier still sat against the wall. For a moment I thought about the long drive I had made that morning, the 20 miles from the farm into town with the smell of smoke still clinging to my coat and the sun rising over fields that used to belong to neighbors I had known for decades. I had not expected luxury or comfort. I had only expected family. Ashley stepped closer to the doorway and crossed her arms again, her expression polite but distant, like someone explaining a store policy to a customer. She said they could not take on another responsibility right now, and that it would probably be better if I looked into a motel in town until things settled down with the insurance company. She even suggested one near the highway that had weekly rates, as if she had thought about this before I even arrived. Daniel nodded slowly beside her, still avoiding my eyes. I realized then that I was standing on the front step of my own son's house with nowhere else to go, and that neither of them seemed to notice how strange that was. So I smiled the way people do when they decide not to argue anymore, thanked them for their time, and lifted my suitcase again. The late morning sun was already warm when I walked back down the driveway toward my old pickup truck. As I opened the door and set the suitcase on the passenger seat, I caught my reflection in the side mirror and saw a tired 68-year-old woman with gray hair pulled back into a loose bun and smoke stains still on the sleeve of her coat. I started the engine and sat there for a minute listening to the low rumble of the truck, thinking about how quickly a life can change. 2 nights ago I had a farm, a home, and a place where every memory belonged to me. Now I had a suitcase, an old truck, and the quiet realization that the people I thought I could count on were already closing their doors. But as I pulled out of Daniel's driveway and headed toward town, another memory began to surface in the back of my mind, one that had been sitting quietly for many years waiting for the right moment to be remembered. I drove slowly through Cedar Ridge that afternoon, passing the same gas station and grocery store I had been visiting for more than 30 years, but everything felt strangely different, as if the town I knew had shifted just a few inches to the left. The motel Ashley had mentioned sat just off the highway with a faded blue sign that promised clean rooms and weekly rates. It was not the kind of place anyone chose for comfort, but it was quiet and the woman at the front desk spoke kindly when she saw the tired look on my face. I paid for a small room for the week and carried my suitcase inside, the wheels of it bumping softly against the concrete walkway. The room itself was simple, just a narrow bed, a small wooden desk, and a window that looked out toward the parking lot where trucks rumbled past every few minutes on the highway. I set my suitcase on the chair and sat down on the edge of the bed, letting out a long breath I had not realized I was holding. For the first time since the fire, the silence around me felt complete. No crackling smoke in the distance, no uncomfortable conversation at Daniel's front door, just the hum of the air conditioner and the faint sound of traffic outside. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the old photograph of my husband, Thomas Whitmore, the same picture that had sat on my bedside table for years. In the photograph he stood beside the barn wearing his work hat and smiling the way he always did when he believed the future was secure. Thomas used to say that land was more than soil and fences, that it was a promise you made to the people who came after you. When he passed away 12 years ago, I promised him I would keep the farm running as long as I could. And I did. Through drought seasons and harsh winters, through machinery that broke down at the worst possible times, through years when crop prices dropped lower than anyone expected. I managed because that farm was not just a business. It was the place where our family story began. As I sat there holding that photograph, another memory quietly returned to me, one I had not thought about in a very long time. Many years ago, before Daniel was old enough to help around the farm, I used to take small babysitting jobs in town during the summers to earn a little extra money. One of those jobs was for a young couple who had just moved to Cedar Ridge with their little boy. His name was Ethan Caldwell. He was the kind of child who asked 1,000 questions about everything from tractors to thunderstorms, and he loved visiting the farm whenever his parents brought him out on weekends. I remembered how he would run across the grass chasing the chickens while laughing so loudly the sound carried all the way to the barn. Time moved on the way it always does. His family eventually moved away. Daniel grew up, and life continued in its ordinary rhythm. I had not spoken to Ethan Caldwell in more than 20 years. Yet as I sat alone in that quiet motel room, staring at the old photograph of my husband and thinking about the life that had suddenly been taken away from me, the memory of that curious little boy kept returning again and again, as if it was gently knocking on the door of my mind and waiting for me to notice something important I had almost forgotten. That evening I sat at the small wooden desk in the motel room with a paper cup of coffee that had already gone cold, watching the sun slowly disappear behind the line of trees across the highway. Cars passed every few seconds, their headlights sliding across the curtains like quiet reminders that the rest of the world was still moving forward. My life, however, felt as if it had paused somewhere between the farm I lost and the family that no longer seemed to have room for me. I picked up the photograph of Thomas again and placed it carefully on the desk in front of me. For a long moment I simply stared at it, remembering how he used to say that when life pushed you into a corner, the best thing to do was sit still long enough for your memory to catch up with you. Thomas believed that people often forgot their own strength because they were too busy looking at the problem right in front of them. I let out a slow breath and leaned back in the chair, allowing my thoughts to wander further into the past. That was when the memory of Ethan Caldwell became clearer. I could still picture him as a boy sitting on the wooden steps outside our farmhouse with a glass of lemonade in his hands, asking me questions about everything, from how corn grew so tall to why tractors needed such big tires. His parents had been young professionals who moved to Cedar Ridge for a few years when Ethan was about 8 years old. They were kind people but very busy, so during the summers the first often watched Ethan in the afternoons after finishing my work around the farm. Some days he would sit at the kitchen table drawing pictures while I prepared dinner, and other days he would follow me around the yard carrying a small notebook where he wrote down everything he learned. I remember once he asked me what the secret to running a farm was, and I told him the same thing Thomas always said, which was that patience and responsibility mattered more than anything else. Ethan listened carefully and nodded in that serious way children sometimes do when they believe every word an adult says. After his family moved away we lost touch, the way people often do when life carries them in different directions. I assumed he had grown up somewhere far from Iowa and built a life of his own. Years passed, Daniel became an adult, and the farm demanded my attention every single day. But as I sat there in that quiet motel room with nothing but time and memories, a faint detail began to return to me. A few years ago I had seen Ethan's name mentioned in a newspaper article at the grocery store checkout line. The article talked about a young businessman who had built a successful technology company, and whose last name sounded strangely familiar. At the time I glanced at the photo and wondered if it could possibly be the same curious little boy who used to chase chickens across my yard. I never gave it much thought after that moment because life on the farm always kept me busy. Now, however, sitting alone in that small room with the hum of the highway outside and the uncertainty of tomorrow hanging quietly over me, I found myself wondering if that memory had come back for a reason. I reached into my purse and took out my old phone, the one I mostly used for simple calls and the occasional message from Daniel. My fingers rested on the screen for a moment as I thought about how many years had passed since I last spoke to Ethan Caldwell. Part of me felt unsure whether it would even make sense to reach out after such a long time. Yet another part of me remembered the boy who once promised that he would never forget the farm where he spent some of his happiest childhood afternoons. And for the first time since the fire, I began to consider the possibility that perhaps the past still held one door that had not completely closed. I sat at the small desk in the motel room for a long time with my phone resting quietly in my hand, staring at the blank screen as if the answer to my situation might somehow appear there on its own. Outside the window the steady stream of cars on the highway continued moving through the night, their headlights sweeping across the curtains every few seconds like a silent clock reminding me that time never waits for anyone. I thought about Daniel and Ashley sitting comfortably in their house across town, probably finishing dinner or watching television, and I wondered if either of them had thought about me again after I left their driveway that morning. The truth was I did not expect them to call. Something in Ashley's voice had made it clear that my presence in their life had suddenly become an inconvenience they preferred to keep at a distance. I was 68 years old and for the first time in decades I found myself sitting in a place that did not feel like home, holding a phone number that I was not even sure still belonged to the person I remembered. I slowly opened the search application on my phone and typed the name Ethan Caldwell. Within a few seconds several articles appeared on the screen, each one showing the same confident-looking man in a tailored suit standing beside buildings and conference tables that belonged to a world far removed from my small farm in Iowa. One headline mentioned that he had built a technology company that grew faster than anyone expected. Another article talked about a foundation he created to support education in rural communities. I looked closely at the photograph beside the article, and although the boy I once knew had grown into a tall professional man, there was still something familiar in his eyes that made me pause. For a moment I wondered if it would be foolish to reach out after so many years. People change. Successful people especially often have little time for the small details of their childhood. But then another memory returned to me, clear and simple. I remembered Ethan standing in the kitchen doorway when he was 10 years old, holding a jar of homemade strawberry jam I had just given him, and saying very seriously that one day when he grew up he would do something important and he would come back to visit the farm that helped him learn how the world worked. Children say many things they later forget, but the way he said those words had always stayed with me. I looked down at the phone again and noticed that one of the articles included a business contact number for the Caldwell Foundation. My thumb hovered over the screen as I considered how unusual this moment was. 2 days ago my biggest concern had been whether the rain would arrive in time for the late summer crops. Now I was sitting alone in a roadside motel wondering if the curious boy I once babysat might remember an old woman from a farm in Iowa. I took a quiet breath, thinking about Thomas and the advice he always gave me about facing difficult moments with calm patience. Finally, I tapped the number and held the phone to my ear while it began to ring, each tone echoing softly in the quiet room, as I waited to see whether the past would answer. The phone rang once, then twice, and by the third ring I began to wonder if I had made a mistake by calling so late in the evening. I almost pulled the phone away from my ear when the ringing suddenly stopped and a calm professional voice answered on the other end. A woman introduced herself as an assistant with the Caldwell Foundation and politely asked how she could help me. For a moment I felt uncertain about what to say, because it had been more than 20 years since I last spoke to the boy whose name was now attached to such an important organization. I cleared my throat and explained that my name was Margaret Whitmore, and that I had once known Ethan Caldwell many years ago when he was a child living in Cedar Ridge, Iowa. There was a brief pause on the line as the assistant listened carefully. She asked me to hold for a moment while she checked something. The quiet music that followed filled the motel room as I sat there staring at the desk in front of me, wondering whether Ethan would even remember the farm where he once spent his summer afternoons. After about 30 seconds, the music stopped and another voice came onto the line. A deeper voice that carried the steady confidence of someone used to making important decisions. The man spoke my name slowly, almost as if he was testing whether the memory was real. Margaret Whitmore. I felt a small jolt of recognition when I heard the warmth in his tone. Before I could respond, he continued speaking, and the excitement in his voice became unmistakable. He said that he had not heard that name in years, but that he would recognize it anywhere. He began laughing softly as he asked if I was the same Margaret who used to make homemade strawberry jam, and who once taught him how to collect eggs from the chicken coop without frightening the hens. I felt a smile spread across my face for the first time in days. I told him that yes, I was the same Margaret and that I still remembered the little boy who filled an entire notebook with questions about tractors and thunderstorms. Ethan paused for a moment and then said something that surprised me even more. He told me that he had often spoken about that farm during interviews because it was one of the places that shaped how he thought about work and responsibility. He said that when he was young, watching the daily rhythm of life on the farm helped him understand that success rarely came from shortcuts, and that patience mattered more than most people realized. I listened quietly while he spoke, still slightly amazed that the curious child I once babysat had grown into someone whose voice carried such authority and confidence. After a few minutes, he gently asked what had made me think of him after so many years. I hesitated at first because I did not want to sound as though I was asking for help, but the sincerity in his voice made it easier to explain the situation. I told him about the fire at the farm, about the damage that left the house unlivable for now, and about how I was staying in a small motel while waiting for the insurance company to review everything. There was a long pause on the line when I finished speaking, the kind of silence that tells you someone is thinking carefully. Then Ethan spoke again, and this time his voice carried a firm determination that made me sit up a little straighter in my chair. He said, "Margaret, you once helped a very curious little boy believe that the world was full of possibilities, and I have never forgotten that." Then he added something that I did not expect at all. He said that he would be in Iowa within 48 hours, and that he wanted to see the farm for himself. After the call ended, I remained seated at the small desk for several minutes, holding the phone in my hand as if the conversation had not quite finished yet. The quiet hum of the motel room returned around me, but something inside my chest felt different, lighter somehow, as though a small window had been opened in a room that had been closed for too long. I had not expected Ethan Caldwell to remember me so clearly, and I certainly had not expected him to say he would come to Iowa within 48 hours. For a long time I simply stared at the desk and thought about how strange life could be. 2 days earlier I had watched smoke rise over the fields where my husband and I built our entire future. That morning my own son had stood in his doorway unsure whether there was space for me in his home. Yet now a boy I once babysat had spoken with the same warmth and respect he had shown as a child sitting at my kitchen table. The next morning I woke early, just as I always had on the farm. The sunlight coming through the motel window was pale and quiet, and for a moment I forgot where I was. Then the memories returned slowly and I sat up, folding the blanket neatly at the foot of the bed the way I had done every morning of my life. I spent the day making a few phone calls to the insurance company and speaking with the county office about the condition of the property. Everyone was polite but cautious, explaining that assessments and Paperwork would take time. I understood that process well enough. Farms were large properties and nothing about them moved quickly when official documents were involved. Late that afternoon my phone rang again while I was sitting in the small chair beside the window. The number was unfamiliar, but when I answered I heard Ethan's voice immediately. He explained that his flight had landed in Des Moines earlier than expected, and that he was already driving toward Cedar Ridge. I felt surprised by how quickly he had acted, but there was an easy certainty in the way he spoke that reminded me of the determined boy who used to follow me around the farm asking how everything worked. He asked where I was staying and I told him about the motel near the highway. There was a short pause before he chuckled gently and said he would arrive within 30 minutes. When the call ended I stepped outside onto the narrow walkway that ran along the front of the building. The evening air carried the soft scent of fields and distant rain, the same familiar smell that had followed me through every season of farm life. Cars moved steadily along the highway while the sky slowly turned shades of orange and blue. I waited there quietly, unsure of what to expect after so many years. Then, just as the sun dipped lower behind the trees, a dark vehicle turned off the highway and rolled into the gravel parking lot. It was a long black sport utility vehicle, the kind that looked more at home outside tall office buildings than beside a roadside motel. The engine slowed and the vehicle stopped a few spaces away from where I stood. The driver's door opened and a tall man stepped out, adjusting his jacket as he looked around the parking lot. When his eyes met mine across the gravel, his expression changed immediately into a wide familiar smile that carried the same warmth I remembered from a curious 10-year-old boy standing in my kitchen many summers ago. For a moment neither of us spoke as he walked across the gravel parking lot toward me, the evening light stretching long shadows across the ground. Up close I could see the years that had passed since the last time I saw him, yet the kindness in his expression had not changed at all. "Ethan." Caldwell stopped a few feet away and shook his head slightly as if he was still trying to believe that we were standing face to face again after so many years. Then he stepped forward and gently took my hands in his, greeting me with the same warmth someone might show a close relative they had not seen in a long time. He said that he could hardly believe how much the farm in those summers had stayed in his memory. We stood there for a minute talking about small things at first, the long drive from the airport, the quiet town of Cedar Ridge, and how different everything must look to someone who had spent the last decade working in cities full of tall buildings and constant activity. Eventually Ethan glanced toward the highway, and then back at me with a thoughtful expression. He said that before we talked any further he wanted to see the farm. I nodded and told him that it was about 20 miles outside town, the same road he used to travel with his parents when they came out on weekends. Within a few minutes we were both sitting inside the large vehicle as it rolled slowly out of the motel parking lot and headed toward the countryside. The drive felt strangely familiar to me, passing the same stretches of open land that had been part of my life for decades. Ethan listened quietly while I explained what had happened during the fire, and what the insurance company had told me so far. When we finally turned onto the gravel road leading to the farm, the headlights illuminated the dark outlines of the buildings that once stood proudly against the fields. We stepped out of the vehicle and walked a short distance toward the barn area where the damage was most visible. The night air was cool and still, carrying the faint smell of smoke that had lingered since the incident. Ethan stood with his hands in his pockets, slowly looking across the property in silence. I watched his face carefully but could not quite read what he was thinking. After a few minutes he turned toward me and asked several practical questions about the land, the acreage, the insurance coverage, and the structures that could possibly be rebuilt. His voice had shifted into the calm, focused tone of someone used to solving complicated problems. I answered each question as clearly as I could, explaining that the farm covered nearly 120 acres, and that most of the land itself was still healthy and ready for planting once the damaged structures were replaced. Ethan nodded thoughtfully as he looked across the dark field stretching into the distance. Finally he let out a slow breath and turned back toward me with the same steady confidence I had heard earlier on the phone. He said that everything he had achieved in his life began with the lessons he learned here, watching the discipline and patience it took to run a farm day after day. Then he said something that made me realize this visit was not simply about memories. He said that he had already contacted several people from his company during the drive, and that by the next morning a small team would begin evaluating the property, so they could plan how to rebuild what had been lost. The next morning the farm felt different for the first time since the fire. When the sun rose over the fields, the light stretched across the land the same way it had for 40 years. But now there was movement again where silence had been only a day earlier. A line of trucks arrived slowly along the gravel road, each one carrying people with clipboards, measuring tools, and equipment I had not seen on the property before. Ethan had told me the night before that his team would come early, but seeing it with my own eyes still felt almost unreal. I stood beside the fence near the old barn foundation while the group walked across the property studying the ground, speaking quietly among themselves as they measured distances and wrote notes about the structures that would need to be rebuilt. Ethan stood nearby with his hands resting comfortably in the pockets of his jacket, watching the process with the calm confidence of someone who had organized projects much larger than this. After a while he walked over to where I was standing and looked out across the acres of farmland stretching toward the horizon. He said the soil still looked strong and healthy, and that the most important thing was that the land itself had survived. I nodded, feeling the familiar breeze move across the fields the same way it had every season of my life. For a moment I thought about Thomas again and the promise I had made to keep the farm alive as long as I could. Ethan then explained that his company planned to rebuild the main barn and equipment storage first, using modern materials that would last longer and handle the weather better than the older structures. He also mentioned that he wanted to create a small agricultural training program on part of the land, a place where young people from nearby towns could learn about farming the same way he had learned during those summers long ago. As he described the idea, I could hear the same excitement in his voice that the little boy once had when he asked questions about tractors and planting seasons. Later that afternoon we drove back into Cedar Ridge to pick up a few documents from the county office. When we stopped at a small cafe near the town square, several familiar faces looked up with curiosity as Ethan held the door open for me, and we walked inside together. Word about the trucks at the farm had already begun spreading through town, the way news always travels quickly in a place where everyone knows one another. As we sat near the window with 2 cups of coffee, I noticed a car pass slowly outside. Through the glass I recognized Daniel's truck, and in the passenger seat Ashley turned her head slightly toward the cafe as if she was trying to understand what she was seeing. I did not wave or call out. I simply sat there quietly, listening while Ethan spoke about the plans for the farm and the future he believed the land still held. For the first time since the fire, the road ahead no longer looked uncertain. The farm that once felt lost was beginning to take shape again, and the lesson Thomas always believed in had quietly proven itself true once more. Sometimes the people who remember your kindness the longest are not always the ones you expect.